The name alone evokes important feelings within popular culture and indeed more so in the recollections of those who lived and failed in the megacity during the battle itself. In terms of mortal casualties, the battle was the most expensive in all of mortal history. Stalingrad was the capstone of a new period of mechanized warfare and the antipode with a bright future which Fustinus had sounded to marshal in at the launch of the century. A titanic battle of polar testaments. Stalingrad, now the ultra-modern-day megacity of Volgograd, was the stage for the definitive battle between two new opposing totalitarian systems which had developed during 20th century: right sect fascism on the one hand and left sect communism on the other, both violent, brutal interpretations of Fustinus. Just 3 times before, still at the launch of the war with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia were abettors. In September 1939, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia both raided Poland contemporaneously from the east and from the west, therefore starting the alternate world war. For the first 2 times of the war, an uneasy alliance was between the Germans and the Russians, who were both content for the time being to divide between themselves. Indeed, before the war, Germany had adjoined Austria in 1938 and taken the Sudetenland border region from Czechoslovakia unopposed. After Poland, Germany fought a whirlwind crusade known as the Blitzkrieg, which combined edge ground, armored and air superiority to take the wholeness of France, Belgium, the Netherlands and Norway. By 1941 they also made in North Africa, nearly taking Egypt from the British, and moved down into the Balkans to subdue Yugoslavia. Russia, on the other hand, used Germany's aggression as a guard for their own aggression against the Baltic countries of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, and also Finland, which had all been part of Russia previous to the 1917 revolution when they broke down the Baltic countries were all severely subdued. Still, Finland, with an army composed substantially of growers and people just guarding their own land, managed to ultimately win against the numerically superior foe. But 1941 Hitler had had enough of his alliance with the Russians as far as he was concerned. Despite the huge politic advantages to the alliance, his war as he saw it had always been to scuffle control of the East from the apparently inferior Slavic nations who lived there to produce living space or Leoben's room for the superior Germanic peoples. The Nazi idea of ethnical superiority was grounded upon the laughably incorrect pseudoscience known as social Darwinism, which was no way taken seriously by factual scientists and only compactly got into the mainstream was the terrible profitable rigors of the 1930s, which had pushed the Nazis into power. Hitler, ever dazed by his own megalomania and no way want to hear to rational advice, soon gave the order to begin medications of the eruption of Russia. Were launched in the summer of 1941. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military crusade ever tried. Over 4 million Axis manned, 3,350 tanks, 2,770 aircraft and 7,200 ordnance pieces. The armies were transnational, comprised of Germans, Romanians, Hungarians, Italians and indeed some Spanish. They told the Russians fully by surprise. Music. On the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Russia had so basically been medieval feudal nation for the peasants, although freed from profitable slavery in 1861. Little have changed. In fact, for numerous, liberation had been worse than the serfdom itself. Russia was an incredibly metropolitan nation compared to the other European superpowers of Britain, France and Germany, which had all industrialized during the 19th century and developed an educated middle class of feathers who could intervene between the super rich and the super poor. No similar industrialization took place in Russia, which was still a veritably unstable country ruled by an aristocratic nobility who held all of the power and all of the plutocrat. Fermentation of the First World War, coupled with centuries of abuse from the upper situations of society, led the Russian people to rise up in popular rebellion, overthrew the monarchy. In the February Revolution in 1917, the world held its breath as a forward-looking popular democracy was installed in the place of the autocratic rule of the captains. Well, the story does not end there. It was just a many months before Bolshevik communist revolutionaries by Vladimir Lenin seized control of the nation. In the October insurrection, the Bolshevik Reds 40 civil war into the monarchists, centrists and conservative whites who were supported by utmost of the nations of Europe, who were fearful of communism at the time. The Reds ultimately won still, and upon seizing control of the entire country continued to collectivize everything in the nation, and is still communist rule with every intention of creating a better future for Russians and the rest of humanity far and wide. Upon Lenin's death, still in 1924, it came decreasingly apparent that this was not going to be the case. The party clerk, a youthful Georgian named Joseph Stalin, had begun still amassing power. This was a man who Lenin had actually advised his comrades to be cautious of, and Stalin played off his political opponents against each other bone by one over the coming many times, frequently before they indeed realized what was passing, having them shot as serpents in the elaborate show trials of the 1930s. Ultimately, he was the only major contender left for power, and one of the only old revolutionaries left alive, and now having total power and control over the country. Stalin the Reds are continued to cultivate his cult of personality, getting a god, such like statuette. In a religionless nation he set about industrializing the nation in his notorious 5-time plan, which amounted to a worse life that numerous had endured under the captains before the revolution. His revolutionary followers waged war against an imaginary class of rich peasants known as the kulaks, who in reality which is well-to-do people in townlets and municipalities, who had made commodity of themselves and were begrudged by their neighbors because of it. The 5-time plan also involved exporting nearly all of Ukraine's abundant force of grain in return for artificial material without actually letting the Ukrainians eat any of it. The Holodomor of the 1930s, which literally translates to death by hunger, was one of the most horrendous genocides of the 20th century and bone that entered little attention at the time as a direct result of Stalin's programs. Millions starved to death en masse in their own homes. What is the world looked on ignorant show municipalities were made up for when intelligencers came to visit. It seems evocative of North Korea moment. By 1939, after a decade of atrocities, persecution and genocide, Russia had industrialized. Upon the launch of the Second World War, then an aggression pact with Germany allowed Russia to take back much of the land lost. At the tail end of World War I began exporting its persecution and atrocities to the recently swallowed-up nations. In 1918, in the Timber of Versailles in France, a peace convention was inked ending the war that was known as the War to End All Wars. The convention agreed that Germany would take all of the blame, and from the vast maturity of the bill for the war, numerous Germans, relatively justifiably, who see this as a great treason by the politicians in power. One of them, a delusional youthful Austrian army officer named Adolf Hitler, took the intelligence indeed further by associating the defeat not just with politicians but with his least favorite nonage, the Jews. Hitler soon joined a right-sect civil association where his drive and his fiery speeches snappily put him to the top of the party leadership. The 1920s Weimar Republic was a fairly stable period in Germany compared to what was to come, and the Nazis, the same as the socialists, did not get a huge quantum of support besides some tried accomplishments which were fluently suppressed. The 1929 Wall Street crash still changed everything. Fiscal help from the United States instantly ended, and the currency inflated so much in Germany the one demanded a oxcart full of plutocrat to buy a loaf of chuck. The government was in shambles. By 1933 the Nazis had come a real force to be reckoned with. Civil groups of goons walked the thoroughfares beating up Jews and socialists, and ultimately Hitler and the Nazi party, seen as a better volition to communism, got a third of the vote and were put into power under the premise that they would make Germany great again. There was further to Hitler's abomination for the weak functionaries who lost World War I. Hitler saw all of the corruption in the world as being linked to a Jewish world conspiracy similar as the one apparently exposed in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a forged document seen as fully genuine by numerous at the time. This depraved worldview was not helped by a fairly wide general anti-Semitic feeling in Europe, which tended to rear its unattractive head at any time when anything went wrong. Unfortunately for anyone who was not a German, Hitler did get Germany's frugality back on track. He also heavily discerned against Jews, socialists, homosexuals, and anyone differently who he saw as been desirable, and by 1938 the Nazi rhetoric was so full on that they looked to absorb other apparently Germanic nations into a lesser German. For Hitler the war was always to be one of German versus Slav and Jew. Underneath his rhetoric of making Germany great again, it was to be a war of obliteration to make land for a lesser Germany upon overrunning Russia. In 1941 this hunger factory began nearly incontinently. The 1 million Soviet dogfaces girdled at Kiev when Germany cannonaded into the Ukraine were placed in large open air camps and left to starve to death en masse incontinently. Behind the standard army bear request colors came the Einsatzgruppen death outfits who shot to death any Jewish civilians they set up. By the time Germany got to Stalingrad in the summer of 1942 the war was in climactic one of obliteration. The Germans, it was a great campaign. For the Russians, a war of survival. By spring 1942, despite failing to capture Moscow and Leningrad in the blitzkrieg as Hitler intended, his position was still strong. On a chart the Germans had taken vast swaths of Russia and devastated large quantities of the Red Army. 3 million men had been captured and some 20,000 tanks destroyed. These huge losses and the great offerings that the Soviets had made allowed them enough time to divert much of the Russian artificial structure to the east of the country, and inventories poured in over the Baltic and over through the Caucasus, through Persia and the Our lives and now. So the Russians is the stylish way to master the Nazis and win the war. Hitler realized the significance of the Caucasus oil painting fields in crippling the Soviet frugality and blocking inventories from the abettors, and he tete-a-tete rewrote the German battle Plans to take on a southerly direction and move the emphasis of the attack down from Moscow by the summer of 1942. Army Group South was advancing headlong through the Red Army towards the oil-painting fields of the Caucasus. Despite putting up fierce resistance, the Russians could do little to repel the largely trained German war machine which steamrolled towards them. Propaganda and factual realities filtered back to both sides, who infrequently took captures. As a result, on July 28 Stalin issued his notorious not one step backwards order, whereby explicitly proscribed the Red Army to retreat. Famines between the advancing Germans and the detachment Red Army outfits. It would shoot to death any retreating dogfaces. The Russians had no choice but to fight, and frequently they were killed nearly to a man in terrible last days. As to the Germans, the megacity of Stalingrad was little further than a name on the chart, but to the Russians it came a symbol of resistance. They were loath to lose the megacity that bore the name of their leader, and so it was at Stalingrad on the Volga that they would make their numbers for both Stalin and Hitler. Stalingrad snappily became a matter of prestige far beyond its strategic significance. The Soviet High Command moved units from the Red Army Strategic Reserve in the Moscow area to the lower Volga and transferred aircraft from the entire country to the Stalingrad region. Meanwhile, the German 6th and 4th Armies went to the Volga and the Don rivers circling Stalingrad in a pincer movement. In early August, during the Kot-Levant operations, Soviet armies courageously threw themselves against the German northern hand in an attempt to decelerate their advance towards the megacity. 200,000 dogfaces lost their lives in this advance alone, while contemporaneously the Red Army defended the grounds towards the megacity. Tooth and nail Soviets managed to get important of the grain and artificial structure out of the megacity, but not utmost of its occupants, who had no choice but to bunker down with the Red Army and stay for the ineluctable German advance. Now, with little food to eat and inventories to keep them warm, in 1942 the Luftwaffe was by far the largest and most important air force in the world and fluently swept the Soviet Air Force away, enjoying total air superiority. The Germans thundered over the megacity, obliterating it in a whirlpool of horsepower. Stalin had refused to void a mercenary population which prior to the battle had stood at around 400,000 people. A huge quantum failed in the bombing injuries which left the megacity little further than a charred geography of remains and debris, but still the Red Army stood its ground. The little choice but to fight. Well over 10,000 Red Army dogfaces were shot down by their own men or treating during this period, but the vast majority do feel authentically to have been prodded on by abomination of the Germans and corrosiveness of their own country, ultimately hugely devastated by the Germans. The remaining Russians had no choice but to fall back to the outskirts of the megacity, where at forward command posts as close to the front as possible, lost any and all available dogfaces were rushed in from all corners of the country to bolster the megacity protectors. Numerous of these were raw selectees with no training or previous knowledge of warfare. In the 12th of September the first battles began within the megacity limits. The fighting was brutal. Hand figure into erecting. The Russians had snappily realized that the nearer they were to the front line, more defended they were from the Luftwaffe. Bombing runs, which hastened the protectors of Wolf. Further positions were set up just meters down from the advancing Germans, who paid dearly for every advance they made into the megacity. Road by road the Germans inched their way through the charred remains with huge casualties being foisted on both sides. The Russians used the megacity seamsters to navigate around and to launch surprise attacks on the German army advancing through the megacity. By the end of September still and during mid-October the Germans took nearly the wholeness of the megacity besides the northern plant quarter, but the protectors desperately column awaiting mounts from the east. Violent gun battles took place within the charred remains, as the Soviets churned out uncolored tanks from the plant quarter straight into the battleground. Eventually, after 3 months of violent pestering fighting, frequently hand to hand with shovels and blunt instruments, the Germans made it to the banks of the Volga. The Russians, with the exception of scattered pockets of resistance, were largely pushed to the far side of the Swash, whilst the Germans held much of the megacity. Soviets still controlled the ferries, their inventories on the east bank, and that continued to pour further and further mounts across the hardly held strip of land. Numerous of these raw rookies, as opposed to the Germans, who substantially were stagers at this point. By this stage the Russians had lost millions of dogfaces, not to mention civilians. German losses also mounted up as to their will to fight, but there had been system to the Russian madness. As the whirlpool of violence erupted around Stalingrad, the Red Army been assembling a huge force with the end thing of encircling Stalingrad entirely. 22nd of January the commander of the German 6th Army General Paulus, a seasoned battleground commander, asked Hitler if he could pull out of the megacity and save the rest of his men. Hitler's response was to inform him of his immediate creation to the rank of Field Marshal, a great honor, but a clear instruction from Hitler, as no German field marshal had ever surrendered, as winter set in the 6th Army, for better or for worse, prepared to make its standard Stalingrad. General Manstein, another fabulous establishment after commander, indeed came down from Leningrad to try and break through the trapped German dog faces, but they could not break through the Soviet forces, who had successfully embrangled down the German. Not for Stalingrad to regroup and amass for a counterattack. Unlike Hitler, Stalin left his generals to make their own military opinions. This was one of his strongest attributes as the leader, and Operation Uranus was what his commanders came up with: a massive Soviet counteroffensive. Over 1 million Red Army colors had a master-armed Stalingrad, and by February completed the sequestration of the megacity along with the 6th Army trapped within. For a while the Germans were suitable to resupply their men from the air ahead. Long the situation came decreasingly hopeless. From 2nd of February 1943, General Paulus surrendered along with the 91,000 Axis survivors. Out of these men, only around 5,000 made it back to Germany after the war. The news of the 6th Army handovers and shockwaves through Germany. The insurmountable Nazi war machine had been defeated conclusively, and the armies that defeated them no intention of stopping at the Volga. The Soviets pushed back through their own lands, discovering terrible atrocities as they went, Johnny in bold and farther, ultimately leading them to commit numerous atrocities of their own against German civilians. After 500,000 Soviet civilians who had inhabited Stalingrad before the battle, only 1,500 remained at the battles, and the mercenary death risk exceeded 200,000. Larger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki together, nearly 500,000 Axis dogfaces and well over 700,000 Soviets failed in the battle, along with numerous further wounded. Russia had come back from the point of collapse. Indeed, though the war would drag on for another 2 times.